afternoon, everyone. Normally, it would be my pleasure to provide the very interesting biographies of these wonderful people who have agreed to speak to us today about religion and public life. Unfortunately, they have to leave us very early for an important vote on the Hill. So I direct you to please look at your program for the lovely biographies that are there. I think these faces are very well known to all of us in the room. And I'd like to get started on what's really important, which is hearing from them to talk about religion and public life. The inspiration for this panel really came to us serendipitously in connection with the conference. As we were thinking about how to involve parliamentarians in the conference, I'm also the past coordinator of the new MA program in religion and public life here at Carleton University. Its first cohort was last year, and our second cohort is just going to be graduating this summer. And we really saw some important connections there in terms of the kind of themes that the conference was considering and also what the program was interested in talking about. So we reached out to the students and we said, who would you like to hear from? And these are the people they wanted to hear from. So we invited each, and they kindly agreed to join us and to participate in this conference, even though this is a very busy time in Parliament. And I also asked the students to prepare some questions. So I have 6 questions that are prepared, and we'll go through them, and then we'll turn over to the audience for more questions. So the order of events shall be that each will speak very briefly, 3 to 5 minutes, with some preliminary remarks. Then we'll work our way through the questions and continue the conversation. So just in order, we'll be having speak Mr. Mark Adler, and then the Honourable John McKay, and then Ms. Elizabeth May. So I'd like to turn things over right away to Mr. Mark Adler.
Thank you so much, and I'm so happy to be here to participate in this very, very important conference, and I congratulate you for all the work that you've done in putting this all together. You know, public life and religion. We're so used to, separation of church and state, or synagogue and state. And, growing up as I did in a fairly traditional home, my father was a Holocaust survivor, the only survivor from his family. My mother was born in Toronto, and her parents are from Poland. And so I grew up in a middle-class, kind of Jewish area at Bathurst and Shepherd. I don't know if many of you know Toronto very well, but Bathurst and Shepherd is sort of the heart of the Jewish community in Toronto. And went to a fairly traditional synagogue and kept kosher at home and largely out too, but there were some exceptions from time to time. But, there were a number of things that kind of molded me and have led me on this wonderful journey that I'm on now in public life. And growing up as I did, my father had a number on his arm, and my father passed away 30 years ago. And all of the people that we knew that my parents would associate with were all survivors. Bathurst Manor has the largest per capita number of Holocaust survivors of any area, geographical area outside of Israel. And so whenever we'd get together, families would get together, it would always be with other survivors. And my contemporaries, of course, were the children of other survivors. And all of our parents had the numbers on their arms and all of that. But nobody ever spoke about it. My father never said a word. And my friends' parents never said a word. And so I don't know my father's experience. I've learned some by going down to the Holocaust Museum in Washington recently, and they were able to dig out some information for me. So I know that my father in 1944 was deported from the Lodz ghetto to Auschwitz with his father because his mother and younger brother were taken 2 years before to be gassed at Helnoch death camp. And I know that when my father arrived at Auschwitz in August of 1944, that he arrived there with his father, my grandfather, and when they were told to get off the train, there was, of course, an SS officer there who would, with a flick of his wrist, send Jews in one direction or another direction. One direction meant life as it was then, or to the gas. And with the flick of a wrist, my grandfather was sent one way, and my father was sent for work. My father was 16 at the time. He always lied about his age just at the time so he could be older. So they thought he was 18. And just before the Russians came to liberate Auschwitz in January of 45, I know he was taken on a death march and walked back to Germany and liberated by the Americans from Ravensbrück concentration camp, one of the satellites of Ravensbrück. So I learned all of this, not from anything that he ever told me, but I learned it from documents that researchers were able to find for me at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And there's more there, and I wanted to learn more, but I, at the moment, just said, that's enough for me right now. One day I'll return and we'll learn more. But it's so important because, we talk about memory, and we talk about remembrance, and we say never again. And yesterday we honored 60 Holocaust survivors on Parliament Hill. We gave them all certificates for coming to Canada and choosing hope. Hope over despair. And they came to Canada because I'll tell you, if anybody had a right to give up on humanity, it was Holocaust survivors. To be treated as subhuman, to have your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, your cousins, your children murdered in front of your eyes, and to be the only survivor from a family that was once bustling and with bar mitzvahs and weddings and synagogue events, community events, and to be the last person left alive. And to choose life over despair. So many of these, the ones we honored yesterday, came to Canada. And now we say never again. But what do we mean by never again? We've seen a number of other genocides take place. We thought this as the First World War was the war to end all wars. Well, we thought the murder of 6 million Jews was the last genocide. We've had a number of genocides since then. But let me tell you, when we say never again, it has largely become a slogan for remembrance. What's more important is that never again should not just be a slogan, but it should be a call to action. Memories are not enough. So many survivors, and I know this from firsthand experience, did not talk about their experiences in Europe up until about 20, 25 years ago. I know with the release of Schindler's List, people started to talk. But nobody spoke before that. And now we have all these testimonies. The Israeli Foundation is doing wonderful work, and Spielberg Foundation is doing wonderful work, taking down testimonies and recording them so everybody will know. Because 6 million people were murdered, and these 6 million people who were largely nameless, not only is it important to know how they died, but we need to know also how they lived, how they hoped, how they dreamed. These were all individual people, individual lives. And they sat in auditorium like we sit here today. The call to action, and I'll just finish up on this because I know I'm probably running over time. But the call to action needs to be that the survivors, if possible, need to tell as much as they possibly can to their children, to their grandchildren. You know, it says in the book of Yoel, in the Chumash, the Old Testament, that we need to tell our children, and our children need to tell their children, and their children need to tell their children. Like we sit every year at the Passover Seder, and we talk about the story of the Exodus from Egypt, we need to tell the story of what happened between 1933 and 1945, and then that experience between 45 and from when they came here, or wherever. It is so important that we know. It is so important that we take that information and we assimilate it and we keep talking about it and telling everyone who wants to listen or whoever doesn't even want to listen. We need to keep talking about it because we cannot allow it to happen again. Because remember, it all happened with words. It started with words and it ended with 6 million people dying in gas chambers. So I'll stop here, and I could go on and on, but
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn things to you.
Thank you, Deidre. And I have never heard your story before, Mark, and it's very moving and very touching. And obviously my experience has not been the experience of you or your family. But I did pick up on one comment, and that was the choose life. And that comes from, I believe, Moses' conversation with God or with the people of Israel, I'm not quite sure. And it's in Deuteronomy, and it says, I put before you life and death. Choose life that your days may be long upon this earth. And I'm misquoting her, but it's something of that nature. And indeed, as a Christian with Jewish roots, that is a core motivation of my life, and I would say the life of practicing Christians, that you continually choose life. You have to continually choose life, and therefore you have to continue to hope and not despair. And to bring that into public life, for me, it happens in several ways. On a personal level, I go to a large evangelical church on Shepherd Avenue, not too far from where you are.
which one I'll visit.
People's Church, between Bayview and Yonge, and you're more than welcome. And we now have 3 services, and we're packing them in. And interestingly, last Sunday, we were having our global missions outreach. And one of the projects that the church has picked up on has been the rescue of people being trafficked, primarily women being trafficked. And this is a pretty significant commitment for the church. We already have an operation in India because there's a lot of women being trafficked in India, and we are expanding that operation. We are also setting up an operation in Moldavia, and we're also setting up an operation in downtown Toronto. It is a bit of putting your money where your mouth is, putting your faith into action. St. Paul has said, faith without deeds is like a clanking cymbal. And surely to goodness, there are way too many clanking cymbals in this world, and we need a bit more action. I wanted to bring us back to the role of faith in public life, because it does create some dilemmas, very awkward moments. And if I took off my shirt, unlike my co-leader, I'll keep it on. I could show you a lot of political scars from my dilemmas between faith and politics. And it does create some, frankly, awkward moments for me. You can name the hot button issues for it creates awkward moments, but in other respects as well. We are in a post-Christian era in this country. When I was growing up, it was, in a sort of way, a Christian country. It's clearly post-Christian. We're not quite sure what we are right now, but I think we are certainly a pluralistic society, but we haven't actually figured out what pluralism means. And we don't practice it very well. We have these nice little multicultural things, and people dance and do whatever it is they do, and there's all kinds of speeches about whatever they're about. But we have not actually, in my judgment, embraced the significance of pluralism in our society. And for religious people, it's particularly problematic because the default position in Canadian society is an absence of religion. In other words, you do whatever it is you do on Friday or Saturday or Sunday in our case, but the adults take over the conversation on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and that's how we fashion public policy. We're kind of a religion-free society, and at least we're trending that way. We're not. And the conflict in my mind, and particularly in my riding, which is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious riding, is that if you go down Markham Road, start Markham Road in 401, and for those of you from Toronto know what I'm talking about, you go from the top to the bottom, and there's virtually no faith group that's not covered off by them. In fact, we've even got Druze. Now that is a sect within a sect within a sect, but interestingly critical to the Syrian conflict. Anyways, my point being that we as a society need to pursue what it means to not only tolerate religions, but people of faith, and expect them to participate in the fashioning and shaping of our public policy. And that will create awkward moments. And in fact, on Saturday night, I'm going to have one, because I have to go to a Muslim function and talk about the conflicts, quote unquote, between Sharia law and the expectations of Canadian law. It's going to be we're just full of awkward moments around here. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. I'm more than delighted to work our way through these questions, but we are politicians and we do prattle on for a while. So thank you for your time and attention.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. McKay. Ms. May?
Yeah, let me say one thing that people may not know about politics in Canada, because all you see is people fighting, is that I consider both Mark and John good friends, and I think the world of them. And some of us have even prayed together on occasion. What I want to share first is back to this notion of public policy and religion. First, briefly give you a sense of my own faith tradition and where I sit on these issues, and then in Canada as a context where religion and public policy fit and don't fit. So first thing I'll just tell you about myself is that, like John, I'm a Christian. I am part of an Anglican tradition, although I can tell you very, very briefly that when I was 2, my mother pulled us out of church because the minister wouldn't take one of her petitions against nuclear weapons testing. I briefly attended Quaker meeting until the Quaker meeting house refused to house and billet people who were peace marchers, and some of the people at Quaker meeting said, but we don't know who these people are. Should we really take them into our home? So that was it. So my mother held the houses of worship in which she was prepared to go to a very high standard, and they fell short repeatedly. So my faith tradition involves that I started at age 13 deciding I'd like to be bat mitzvahed with my friend Abby. And I went to Rabbi Stanley Kessler, if anyone has ever heard of him. He's a lovely man. He was then rabbi in Hartford, Connecticut, but he started out in Nova Scotia. And he explained to me very patiently, having interviewed me, that I had formed a closer attachment to Jesus Christ than I recognized. And I didn't know the rule about rejecting people 3 times. If I'd known that, I would have been more persistent. As it was, I took his advice. He said, go find whatever church your grandparents belonged to. He knew my mother well. He said, go to find, because they were all active in the civil rights movement together, find whatever church your grandparents belonged to and go see about them. And so I found this little church not far from where we lived that I'd never seen before, and went in the door. Well, my mom had to drive me. I was only 13. It's not like I could get around on my own. And I found that there was a confirmation class starting. So that's all I'll tell you. I ended up, more or less by accident, as an Anglican, but comfortable with it. And there are over 2,000 different denominations within what you would call Christianity. And that's something that's not really known by people, not particularly well known by non-Christians. Night and day, different, all basically in this group, but with significant differences in the way one approaches a lot of things. Now, backing up just to say that my own view of life is, I mean, I'm really comfortable in my faith. I derive virtually every ounce of energy and strength I have from my faith. I try, although it's not always easy, to live it and breathe it every day. But that faith says, and this is where people get in trouble when they're in politics, which I should reflect on in a minute, I'm also leader of the Green Party, which is a political party which embraces membership from people of every faith and of no faith at all. I've got some what I refer to as Bible-thumping atheists.
Shocking.
They really don't want to hear any. I've got people starting petitions against me because of what they call my conspicuous religiosity, which consists of the fact that I wear a cross my mom gave me. You need to make it clear when you're in politics that there is no expectation that people within my party adopt the faith I have. So where does that get us to? In the United States, it's virtually impossible to get elected to office unless you are out there as a Christian.
And you have to have a honking big Bible.
Yeah, and you have to invoke God every other sentence. I mean, it was used as a crack against Barack Obama that he might be Islamic. What's wrong with that, to be president of the United States? The Prime Minister of Australia is an atheist. I don't think there's no expectation on my part that people have to have my religion to play a valuable role in my party, my life. Our candidates talk about the range down Bathurst. I've got candidates, Muslim candidates, obviously Jewish candidates, obviously various Christian candidates, Wiccan candidates, atheist candidates, and there's no differentiation in terms of the inclusiveness that exists around respect for what people believe and what they don't believe. That's a fundamental right. You have just as much right to your religion as you have a right to no religion at all. And that's in the Canadian context. Well, in the US, you have to be Christian to get elected. I have to say, in Canada, it's a distinct disadvantage to be a person who's, as I describe myself, an out-of-the-closet Anglican. The other expectation in Canada, because it's so foreign to our political culture, is that if you are an out-of-the-closet Christian, then you fall into a certain category of what I view as intolerant social beliefs that you want to inflict on other people. And that's something that we can talk about and tease out more. I think the important thing, and I was very taken with it when I heard it from Bill Blakey. He was on many, many years ago, because Bill Blakey is still a friend of mine. He's now in the Manitoba cabinet, but when he was a federal NDP member of parliament, and he is a former United Church minister, he was interviewed on that CBC program Tapestry. And he basically made this point: why is it everybody expects that they're going to hear from a Christian right? What about the Christian left? There's very few people who would speak to that. So my view of religion and public policy is this: there's a separation of church and state, and for a reason. You would never want organized religion to dictate public policy to government. So that's the separation of church and state. But it should not mean, how I think it's interpreted in Canada, that we must airbrush out any signs of religious traditions from those people who are elected to public office. I think the voters in Saanich-Gulf Islands who elected me to Parliament have a right to find out who I am and what makes me tick. That's their right to ask me questions about my religion, and I should answer honestly. It also means that the decisions I make in Parliament are going to be informed by what I think is moral and right. And I don't think I should duck those questions. If people want to ask me those questions, I'll answer those questions. But it also means, in terms of separation of church and state, that you don't inflict views that are intolerant. The essence of what we are in Canada in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms is that respect for what people believe, what they don't believe, and how they live their lives. And within that, we say, this is how we live our lives in Canada, which is why we won't ever invoke Sharia law, with all due respect to people who think that's a good idea. See? So that's how I tease it out. And I know we've talked more in your opening than you probably wanted, Deidre, so I'll stop there.
Well, Deidre, I'm actually having a Bob Ray moment here.
Really? That's impressive.
As you know, Bob is married to a Jewish woman, and he's Anglican.
Yeah.
And he describes it as a choice between the chosen and the frozen.
Not bad. It's very good, actually. Yeah.
Bob's very good.
Yeah.
Very.
John, I thought you were going to switch parties when you said you were having a Bob Ray moment.
That's a good reason to stay there.
Thank you so much for these very lively introductory comments. We needed it. It's been a long day, and I think your energy is wonderful. I want everyone to know here that though this conversation is lovely in this room, it actually goes far beyond these walls. We are recording today's events, and we will be podcasting them, and they will be available on our website and certainly at the members' websites as well. So please do share what you've seen today. Ms. May, you kind of opened the door to this second question that I sent to all of you, which is from our students. Since Canada was founded primarily on Christian principles, do you believe that Canadian civic religion retains a significantly Christian dimension? Is this problematic? And how does the government work in its policies to retain the essence of Canadian values without discriminating against non-Christian groups? So I think you started to open the door, but perhaps you'd like to add a little bit, and then we could hear from the others.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it may be that a Christian is blind on this point, but I do not think the Canadian civic religion or public policy space has a decidedly Christian dimension. Our statutory holidays, yes, I'll give you that. But are they celebrated as religious events? Nope, not particularly. Christmas, which should be a day on which people who are observant are thinking about the birth of Jesus Christ and reflecting on things like love and sacrifice, altruism, generosity, has become a spectacle of consumerism and rampant consumption and is pretty pathetic as a religious holiday. I thought Easter was safe, but no, it's gone the way of the chocolate bunnies. We are losing that as well. So, and you know, so my own view of it is that, and my views on the public space are that it shouldn't be dominated by any religion. So, do I think that's a bad thing? No, not really. But I think people who self-identify as Christians need to do something to make sure our own behavior, not everybody else's, conforms to what we think is important. And I personally think that if you look at the messages of Jesus Christ in the sacred books of my tradition, he talks a lot about fighting poverty. He really is bothered by poverty. I don't see him mention homosexuality ever. So there's certain things that I think, okay, what drives me? What should we do as Christians in using our life and life's work and becoming instruments of something important? Fighting poverty is really off the scale as the important thing to do. In terms of the public space, it shouldn't be dominated by any religion. But I do think we make a mistake when we deny the importance, and I loved the way John just expressed it, that we leave it to the grown-ups Monday to Thursday. There's a general sense right now, and forgive me if this is that what's really important is the economy at all times. A friend of mine who's Buddhist, whose name is Peter Timmerman, who teaches at York, but he's an active Buddhist. And this is, I think, a great insight. He said, people think that in Canada we have no state religion, but we do. It's econotheism. We worship the economy. It has its own set, and this is again me expressing what Peter Timmerman expressed as a Buddhist, it has its own set of doctrine, it has its priesthood, it has its rituals, and its overarching central principle is the celebration of selfish individualism. And as he said, as any of the great religions will tell you, that leads straight to doom. So I think, now mentioning another person, Karen Armstrong, whose books I love a lot, in her book, The Battle for God, which analyzes fundamentalism at the point that becomes dangerous in traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, she says, okay, where does that come from? That impulse to extremism that leads to violence comes from people who look around in their society and say, where is there anything here that feels important? And if it's all about selfish individualism and he who dies with the most toys wins and all that kind of thing, what she says is a lack of balance between mythos and logos. If you keep yourself balanced, if your culture, if your traditions, if your society nurtures your spiritual insides as well as celebrating how rich you are, you really have a balance between logos and mythos. But if you annihilate mythos, you get people who are drawn to extremism. Sorry, Deidre.
Thank you. I'd like to hear what you have to say, because you also opened this door.
Oh, thanks very much. Hey, following Elizabeth the preacher. Take. I don't think there is a civic religion in this country, and I mostly adopt Elizabeth's views on it. But I go back to Canadian values and tease that out a bit. Now, where do Canadian values come from? And what are they? Well, where do they come from? And I would argue that they come from Judeo-Christian values. And to be candid with you, I don't know that we should spend a lot of time apologizing for that. But that is the core of our nation and in the founding principles of our nation. And if you go back to Jesus' words in the New Testament, was what are they? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and all thy soul and all thy mind. And what is the second great commandment? That thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And hereon hang all of the laws and the commandments. I'm slightly misquoting that, but it's close. And you can trace that back into, I think, Deuteronomy or somewhere in there. The point being that those were the founding principles of our nation. And if you do a tour of Parliament, you can actually see some scriptures inscribed into the wall. Do I regard that as problematic? No. These are our traditions, and there's no sense denying that they are our traditions. They animated the life of the founding fathers of our nation, and I believe they still animate many members of Parliament in terms of what they're trying to do, in terms of articulating their views, their values, what their faith traditions are, and articulating them into the public square and the marketplace of ideas. Some will survive, some won't. Some will be challenged, some won't. But I think that religion and politics at its highest is actually not going left and it's not going right. Well, you guys way right, but going deeper. And going deeper, I think you will find many faith traditions which actually push that envelope so that we improve our society.
Thank you. Mr. Adler, do you have something to add?
I do, as a matter of fact.
I would imagine so.
It's nice to see Elizabeth come around here because it's our party who remains committed to what matters most to Canadians: jobs, growth, and long-term prosperity. So, Elizabeth, come on over.
I thought she was going the other way.
I'm not. I think we shouldn't worship the economy.
No, let me just say, in all seriousness, let me just say that, we talk about religion, and I think we need to define sort of what we mean by religion.
As a professor, I'm delighted to hear that.
Good. Glad. I spent
That's
enough
worth
time.
at least 3 classes.
I know a lot of people of faith who, from their outward appearance, you would, yes, look at them and say they are observant, religious, Orthodox people. And they will go to synagogue every day, yet in their daily dealings in business, I wouldn't say they live a very observant life. On the other hand, I know people who do not believe in any God, but they serve in their community organizations, they give of their time, they give of their labor, they give of their love to make the lives of others better. And they are decent people who just want to do right by their community. And to me, people who act that way are far more religious than the people who go to synagogue or church and pray a lot and yet don't live a life of God and of religion. You know, we say that there's no religion in schools, there's no religion in politics. Well, as long as there are elections, politicians are going to believe in God, and as long as there are exams, students are going to believe in God. I don't think we can, dismiss, and we've all grown up in the traditional sort of silos of various religions and what we take to mean as religion. To me, religion is, well, if you happen to be Jewish, yes, you observe as much as you possibly can, but what's more important to me is that you live a life of Judaism, of performing as many mitzvahs as you possibly can. That, to me, is a religious life. Do you have to wear a kippah? Do you have to wear a shtreimel? Do you have to dress in black? No, I don't think so. Yet, so to me, it's more, religion to me is more of a sense of action, of doing the right thing, of looking out for your neighbor, of being there for your family, of giving of yourself to make the lives of other people better. Because I got to tell you, when the most rewarding work I do as a politician is when I'm back in the constituency office and people come in to see me, and for whatever reason, they're new immigrants, they can't speak the language, they just, they're coming to their member of parliament, and we all have this experience because we're in sort of the person of last resort. They don't know where else to go. And so they come to us, and for us, it's an easy thing to do. Sometimes you pick up a phone and just make a phone call, and you change their life. You actually change their life. And this, to me, is the best feeling. It is the most rewarding experience. And it validates every second that I'm in politics, and this is what I work so hard for. And we all work so hard for that. And this is why we all chose a life of public life. So when we say religion, to me, religion is just being there for others, being there to help others, trying to make the lives of others as easy as possible. That is religion to me.
Thank you. Mr. McKay, you could have opened the door to this question.
Oh, go.
Oh, good.
Well.
How do you think we should balance protection of religion with protection from religion? Is it just the days of the week? In other words, how do we retain certain religious values in government policies where they matter to a majority of people and yet protect the minority from being compelled to religious values that are not their own?
Why'd you give me the awkward question?
Because I thought you'd be interesting.
Yeah. Let me register a minor disagreement with Mark, and that is on the definition of religion. And I don't think we're discussing the definition of really good people. I spoke at my former campaign manager's funeral last fall, and you could describe him as an outstanding Christian gentleman, except he'd be appalled by being called Christian. And so I guess for the purposes of this discussion, I'm staying with the concept that there are traditional religions, or non-religion as the case may be. With respect to do we retain religious values in government policies, the most disconcerting experience I have had with respect to this tension, protection from religion, had to do with the airplane disaster, the Swiss Air disaster off the East Coast. And there the chaplains that
had gathered, the religious figures that had gathered, had got explicit instructions that they were basically to scrub religion out of any memorial services. And not only on the East Coast, but on the lawn of Parliament Hill. And there was a lot of people really upset about this, that the memorialization of the deaths of these people in the airplane, any claim to faith, and it didn't really much matter whether it's Christian or Jewish or Islamic or whatever, was just scrubbed out, and people were those people were marginalized. But whatever else religion does, it does show up at the big events of life, you know, the births, the marriages, the deaths, and for reasons good and bad, we derive comfort from those expressions from a variety of faith traditions. I actually approached Prime Minister Chrétien and Sheila Copps about it, and a week later we had a separate service in what was then 200 West Block, where we invited in the American ambassador and the various faith expressions, and had a separate service. It seemed to me that something had gone off the rails at that point. That in our enthusiasm to be neutral about religion in the public square, we had actually expunged it from the public square. And it was interesting as a public figure to hear the comments of the ambassador of the day, the U.S. ambassador of the day, and the various American officials, that they particularly appreciated the effort to reinsert the various religious expressions into the memorialization of the deaths of those folks in Swiss Air. So, where we go with that, I don't really have a handle, but I think it's worth flagging.
Thank you. I understand that they have to leave us very shortly, so I'd like to close with one last question that brings us back to the themes of the conference. Namely, what is the government doing and what can the government do to enact international policies that would support the phrase "never again," given that people around the world continue to be persecuted on the basis of their religion, race, ethnicity, and sexual preference? And perhaps we could start with Ms. May, and we'll come down
To the government.
Yeah.
Good place to end.
Yeah.
Well, we're in a very odd period of time when having said that in Canadian politics to be discussing religion is almost verboten. You know, you're really not going to be considered. It's somewhat off-putting for the Canadian public to have a government that is promoting the idea of religion as an important value. And I'm only comfortable with the new Office of Religious Freedom in the context of human rights, and I would have rather it was called a Special Office on Human Rights, and of which a fundamental human right is your right to worship or not worship. My fear is that it falls into a certain category of basically, forgive me, Mark, but I don't have to say it, playing to a base within the Conservative Party that must be appeased in the absence of other actions. So it's a political naming as opposed to the public policy purpose of making sure we respect human rights and promote them globally. I have a really hard problem with, I spoke yesterday at the quite moving ceremony at the War Museum for Holocaust Remembrance from the Canadian Society for Yad Vashem, and I asked, how do we what do we do to give meaning to never again? Well, at a minimum, it obviously means that we do not tolerate any new rise of anti-Semitism, that we don't tolerate actions that are targeted against any specific group, but obviously Jewish people is where when we speak of anti-Semitism, we're speaking specifically. But generally, what do we do to say we're going to be prepared better than we were before, and it was Jason Kenney in the service on Parliament Hill who quite rightly mentioned that Canada's performance in accepting European Jewish refugees when we had a chance to save lives was shameful. And we tried to redeem ourselves later by accepting more Holocaust survivors. But when we had a chance to take action, this government under Mackenzie King completely failed in an immoral and impossible situation to imagine. You want to go back, rewind the tape, and say, get those people off the boat in Halifax. We'll take everybody to Saint Louis and send more boats. You know, we missed it again in Rwanda. So I'm not going to answer my own question, but I'm going to ask the question, are we missing it in China? We know that the people who practice Falun Gong and Falun Dafa are imprisoned at high rates. We know the Tibetan Buddhist community is suppressed and in ways that are difficult to imagine. We know that people who are practicing any range of a number of religions or political dissidents within China are persecuted. And yet we're not prepared to say that, you know, we won't go there because right now we really need investment from China. So I'm just asking the question, because I don't want to answer my own question. Are there other places around the world where we're turning a blind eye because for the moment it's more convenient to do so? So it's a plea for consistency. If we're going to be consistent in the defense of human rights, then it has to be, I'm not saying we don't deal with China or trade with China, having picked China as an example. We must, because they're a very important global power. But I don't think we can sell the rights of Tibetan Buddhists short because we really want to conclude a trade treaty. I think we've got to call on ourselves to be consistent.
Thank you.
The connection is government policies, international policies that would support the phrase never again. To answer this question specifically, I think there's two policies. The first is responsibility to protect. The second is responsibility to intervene. The source of those policies is, of course, international literature, et cetera. But the personal source for me is Romeo Dallaire, who, as you know, witnessed the genocide in Rwanda and was very, and is still is, very damaged. I was the chair of the National Prayer Breakfast in 2000. And I watched Romeo on an interview on CBC talking about his book, which is I Know There's a God Because I've Shaken Hands with the Devil. And you may or may not remember the story of Romeo leaving his camp with a couple of his soldiers, coming up to the place where the choke point where the Tutsis were being slaughtered, and they're literally stacked like cordwood on the side of the road. And he's approaching the colonel who is running the operation. And he's in this T-shirt, there's blood up to his elbows. And as Romeo is approaching this guy, Romeo literally doesn't know whether he should pull out his sidearm and put a bullet in this guy's head or whether he should parley. And Romeo tells this story in literally on a step-by-step basis. He ultimately makes the decision to parley, and hence the phrase, I know there's a God because I've shaken hands with the devil. Story within story. I'm in church 7, 8 years ago. I sit down beside this young black guy, and he said, I saw you at the National Prayer Breakfast, et cetera, repeats the story that I've said. I said, well, you know, how do you recall that story so well? And he said, because the devil is my uncle. Now what, you know, the story that brings him from hiding under dead bodies in a stadium in Kigali to Scarborough is quite a story in and of itself. What is the core motivation of why we do what it is we do? And for many of us, it is that faith component. I dare say that if Romeo Dallaire was not the powerful Christian individual that he is, that maybe the impetus and the strength of R2P and R2I, the responsibility to protect and the responsibility to intervene, would not be as influential in our decisions about, or non-decisions about Tibet, or our decisions or non-decisions about Syria, or our decisions or non-decisions about Libya, Mali. Pick your point of never again. And so I'd like to think that we can make the argument that there is some advance in thinking. I don't know if there's a great advance in practice, but at least there's some advance in thinking for the basis for intervention in a genocide or a potential genocide. And maybe I'm just being naive by hanging my hat on R2P and R2I, but as an intellectual framework, as a moral framework, and as a thoughtful approach to the demands of any government over the course of its life to involve itself, I think that's probably one.
Thank you. You have the last word.
Okay. Well, in terms of and if we're going to talk about government action, I mean, certainly our government has taken a number of steps. I know you heard from Jason Kenney earlier today on what we've done in terms of Holocaust remembrance. The Office of Religious Freedoms is funded. It is committed to the monitoring of religious freedoms around the world. Who is the largest group of persecuted peoples now around the world? That's right. That's right. The Christians are the largest group who are being persecuted across the world. It's rife through Muslim countries. When our Prime Minister went to China for the first time, he didn't make any friends over there because he talked mostly about human rights violations in China. Elizabeth said we need to trade. Of course we need to trade. We're in a global economy. But certainly, I know as far as our government goes, we've never missed an opportunity to bring up the issue of human rights and human dignity. Now let me tell you something, that one of my favorite responsibilities as a member of Parliament is going to citizenship swearing-in ceremonies. And people are coming from all over the world. There's probably about 100 at a time. They're coming as adults, they're bringing their children, and they are coming to escape persecution, they are coming to escape racism and all forms of hatred. They are coming to Canada for hope and opportunity for themselves, but more importantly for their children, so they can find a better life here in this country of Canada. Now, I always tell them, when I speak to them at these ceremonies, I say to them that you are coming to this great and wonderful country of Canada, which is giving you opportunity, but with that opportunity comes responsibility. And we're all, the three of us are talking here about action, about words, about never again. And that's why I said at the outset that never again is a call to action. Just can't be a symbolic phrase, a hollow phrase. That's unacceptable. Each of us has a responsibility not to talk, but to get involved and to do something. When we see a wrong, we need to right it. Now, are we going to get there? Are we going to get there all the way on the first time out? Probably not. But we all need to get involved. We all have that responsibility. We live in this great democracy, this wonderful country of Canada, that gives us the freedom to do that. How many people here are involved in organizations that not just get together for meetings, but actually get out on the ground and do something for people? Fantastic. Fantastic. Continue to do that. Those who didn't raise your hands, when we come back next year, I want to see those hands raised. We have that responsibility to each other. let me just conclude by saying that when we talk about never again, it's become symbolic of the Holocaust, but it applies everywhere and with everyone. And it's not just the big genocides. It's not just the Rwandas of the world. It's also about your community. It's about delivering the Meals on Wheels so the person down the block, the senior, doesn't have to sit alone and not have anything to eat, not have any company. This is also your responsibility. Don't take on the big issues of the world before you look after your own community. You know, it's a tenet in Judaism that you're supposed to start with charity at home and in your local community before you reach out beyond your community. So get involved in your community. Make a positive change in someone's life. And that is a call to action. That is never again.
As chair of the conference, I want to offer my heartfelt thanks to each of you for finding time to be with us today and to speak so passionately and also carefully about very, very serious subjects. As the Associate Director of the Zelikovitz Center, I hope this is the beginning of many conversations that we'll share with you. We've made important conversations today and answered some interesting questions, but there's much more to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.